You plan a week ahead for a day at the beach. Unfortunately, it starts raining. You've just been affected by an act of nature. This is a fact of life that people had to contend with on much larger scales, for example, with civilizations. Where we last left off, Sumer was struck with the 4.2 kiloyear event, a climactic disaster which caused famine and drought. In this video, we'll see how Mesopotamia responded to that, as well as how this affected the world in other regions. In this video, I want to continue the story of Mesopotamia itself, yet also expand the discussion into the regions east and west of it. The 4.2 kiloyear event not only caused turmoil in Mesopotamia, but across the globe, leading many communities to migrate in search of new homes. One of these people were the Gutians, who conquered Sumer and quickly assimilated as a ruling class. But another, around 2000 to 1700 BC, came from the south in the Arabian desert. These were the Amorites. The Amorites migrated and flooded the Fertile Crescent. The city-state of Ebla, a Semitic city in Syria, even built a massive southern wall to hopefully repel the migrations. It was to no avail. The Amorites quickly made Mesopotamia their homes, displacing the peoples of various towns like Kish, and with the new population ballooning into cities in their own right. Yet none were so revolutionary as the small town and soon-to-be capital of the world, Babylon. The king of Babylon had a new strategy. This cunning king was Hammurabi, an Amorite himself. From his small domain around Babylon, he used diplomacy to trick surrounding kings into fighting each other, weakening them and thus allowing Hammurabi to conquer with his armies. Once again traveling downstream, he took each city and built himself an empire. Mesopotamia once again saw stability. Yet unlike his predecessor Sargon, Hammurabi wasn't so concerned with two-way assimilation. He instead wanted his subjects to acknowledge the supremacy of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. The cult of Marduk was essential to Hammurabi's rule, because unlike previous Luguls, his legitimacy derived from the gods themselves. From this era, we see cities dotted with statues touting propaganda for the cult of Marduk and the king. And with this newfound power, the king could be the voice of a new idea, the law. Sumerian society had law, but it wasn't necessarily written down or made explicit and direct. Much of it was shrouded in custom, traditions, implicit assumptions, etc. Furthermore, Sumerian law was devoid of official punishment. The victims could simply be compensated for their losses. Sargon must have been fine with this, because if he simply replaced the high priests with Akkadians, he could simply control the customs. But Hammurabi, trying to create his own order instead of settling for local beliefs, must have seen a need for something more direct. So he created a law code which specified all the laws of his land and all the punishments that could be received. He wrote them on large clay tablets and had them placed at the gates of cities so that nobody could pretend that they didn't know about them. And the physical writing was enshrouded in imagery of Marduk and Hammurabi himself, glorifying their absolute power. With newfound stability in the region, a new level of prosperity was created. Under the Babylonian Empire, a new world system emerged. The temple and palace structure still existed, but a new set of cunning individuals emerged. These were the merchants. These men were not just couriers sending deliveries between palaces like employees. They were businessmen in their own right, with power from wealth, and they connected trade between domestic markets directly. This was allowed to happen because domestic households had enough wealth to be able to purchase imported goods for themselves. Likewise, Babylonian law protected property, which was important for the merchant class. The effects of this were difficult to see immediately, but in the long term became far-reaching. Now Mesopotamian society would become much more interconnected with its neighbors. Who were its neighbors anyway? Throughout this series, I've spoken much about the barbarians from the frontier spilling into the bastion of civilization, but this view is flawed. The reality is that Mesopotamia was surrounded by many different settled communities with their own towns, merchants, temples, and even cities and palaces. Let's take a look into who these peoples actually were. I'll start by talking about the western neighbors because they are arguably far more famous. The immediate west was Syria itself, which I already mentioned had old cities like Ebla. They were heavily influenced by the Mesopotamians and even part of Sargon's empire. Even further, you reach the coast, inhabited by people known as the Canaanites. They're perhaps most famous because of their interactions with the Israelites, and possibly even coming from the same people. The northern branch of the Canaanites settled many coastal cities, including Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and others, just as old as the Sumerian cities themselves. The peoples that inhabited these cities were known as the Phoenicians, and they were important maritime traders between the different societies in the Mediterranean Sea, like the Egyptians and the Minoans. They imported goods such as tin, which is important for making bronze, but also other goods. Byblos was an important port for the papyrus market, as in papyrus paper, which is why we call the Bible. That's just where the paper came from. Even further west, and you reach the Minoans on the island of Crete, a trading kingdom regularly dealing with Bronze Age peoples of Europe that we know so little about. Yet one Western society I want to take some time to focus on right now is Egypt, because they have such a unique history that I think is worth discussing. Namely, it was arguably the first ever country, because unlike all the city-states of Mesopotamia, it was an actual kingdom that you could see on a map. Look, here's the map. To understand how Egypt managed to reach this extraordinary political unity over such a large geography, we have to go all the way to the past, back to the first farmers again. The stereotypical picture of Egypt is vast empty deserts with the Nile River alone cutting through the land and giving life to what would normally be a desolate wasteland. But 14,000 years ago, it wasn't like this. No, the Sahara Desert was green, with many hunter-gatherer and farming communities living semi-nomadic lifestyles across the entire continent. And this remained true for thousands of years until the Sahara eventually turned arid. Rainfall became less common and the grasslands responsible for so many ecosystems shriveled up. One must have to imagine the kind of distress that this caused with the local communities as people migrated in various different directions to find sources of food, eventually the majority of them crowding around this one river, the last bastion of hope. That's exactly what Egypt began to be in prehistory. Of course, similarly to Mesopotamia, the Nile River had to be tamed via irrigation. But differently from Mesopotamia, the Nile River was much more predictable than the Tigris and Euphrates ever were. Keep that in mind because this plays an important role as to why Egypt was able to achieve political unity so early. As the Sahara continued to dry, more and more people poured into the Nile Valley, and eventually towns grew into cities. Yet by the 4th millennium BC, there was already larger kingdoms forming from these cities, specifically between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was a collection of towns on the Nile Delta, the part of the river that spills into the Mediterranean Sea. Very little is known about pre-dynastic Lower Egypt. Further up the river was Upper Egypt, which centered on the capital city of Nekhen. It was ruled by various kings that would eventually conquer Lower Egypt and unite all of the Nile. Who was the king to eventually do this? Archaeological evidence points to a man called King Narmer. As commemorated on the Narmer plate, he eventually led his warbands to conquer all of Egypt, with the king standing in the middle, standing tall and delivering the final blow to an enemy. In many ways, this united king of united Egypt was revolutionary to the entire idea of government to this point in human history. This new form of king would be given the name of Pharaoh, named after the household that he came from. This pharaoh would wear the double crown of Egypt, also called the Psent. In many ways, the Psent perfectly embodies the duality and unity of Egyptian society. In the design, the cobra represents the lower Egyptian goddess Wajet, and the vulture represents the upper Egyptian goddess Nekbet. Egypt was a massive land covering many local traditions and cultures, and attempts by central authority to standardize Egyptian mythology would come in vain, leaving it to morph into a vague, confusing, and sometimes outright contradictory mess. Successors of Narmer would continue to struggle to form a state religion because of this. Yet in the end, a balance would simply find itself. Likewise, the pharaoh assumed two roles at once, both as a high priest and a commander of the military. Unlike Mesopotamia, which had a hard separation between the priestly and warrior classes, the pharaoh walked a tightrope of responsibilities between leading armies, as Narmer did, and communicating with the gods. In fact, the pharaoh was considered a god himself, the incarnation of Horus and Ra, the gods of kingship and the sun. Once again, a balance was found. It's difficult to imagine how a single man could look after all of this, especially after just learning the incredible disunity of Mesopotamia. It's perhaps easier to imagine how Egypt was governed once you start to think of the entire Nile River as a single massive city. The Egyptian cities themselves were smaller than the Mesopotamian ones, and the countryside was littered with many more villages. The cities themselves were essentially glorified priest communities, whilst the farmers and craftsmen and what have you were much more spread out around the land. And remember, the Nile was an incredibly calm river. It was said that the pharaoh could personally inspect the entire kingdom from a raft floating downstream. The Nile made the land so incredibly interconnected that political unity was much easier to support. Into the 3rd millennium BC, we enter a period of history called the Old Kingdom. It's most famous because it was during this time that the pyramids of Giza were built, and the magnificent capital city of Memphis fashioned its great temples. These projects were set out by new pharaohs like Imhotep and Khufu. They were absolutely massive structures organizing the resources and labor of all of Egypt and are a true testament to the pharaoh's power. Although military force was technically possible, the true extent of the king's power was cultural in this case. Consider that most of the workers who built the pyramids were likely willing participants. Remember, the pharaoh was a living god, and participating in the construction of his projects was a sign of worship toward him. The pharaoh ruled through religion. He ruled through a concept called Mat. Mat is a goddess, but more importantly, it's a concept of cosmic order. Mat was the representation of truth, justice, and morality. It governed Egyptians to keep being honest, lawful, and honorable. If Mat was not upheld, then the entire cosmic order would collapse and chaos would rule. So the pharaoh had the divine obligation to maintain Mat in the world. Mat was also a governor of the afterlife. Every Egyptian had the chance to live after they die, but only if they maintained their own Mat. In Egyptian mythology, this was believed to be done by the weighing of the heart. If your heart was heavier than the feather of Mat, your soul would permanently be destroyed. This fear of final judgment kept many Egyptians in line, adhering to the practices of good morals, such as the negative confessions. Little is known to what extent Mat was applied to Egyptian law, as few records of it survive. This is possibly because they were written on papyrus, a material that doesn't last long. This is a reminder that we learn history through a flawed lens, that we don't always have the full picture, and that's okay. We simply have to be careful when making generalizations about the past. Nevertheless, we can say that it did have an impact, with images of Maat being fashioned in various parts of judicial life, strengthening central authority in Egypt. Unfortunately, the Maat that the pharaohs strived to maintain for so long did not last forever. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, the Old Kingdom collapsed and Egypt fell into that chaos that Egyptians feared so much. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, as powerful as they were, did delegate their power to local regions. These regions were called nomes, ruled by men called nomarchs. Over time, they did garner more and more power than the pharaoh in their local communities. Likewise, an independent priestly class did emerge during this time. They declared that the pharaoh wasn't literally Horus and Ra, but merely their son, directly questioning the authority of the pharaoh. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, all of these social contentions were thrown into flux thanks to nature herself. By this time, the 4.2 kiloyear event was starting to affect Egypt as well, causing famine. What's more, the last king of the Old Kingdom lived for so long that he outlived all of his heirs, meaning that when he died, there was nobody to take over after him. All of this together led to Egypt just finally collapse into the first intermediate period. The local nomarchs competed with one another to see who would finally reunite Egypt. And that was finally accomplished. By the turn to the 2nd millennium BC, Egypt was once again reunited into the Middle Kingdom. Yet, the decentralization wasn't entirely reversed. The nomarchs maintained their power in their local nomes, and the priestly class continued to grow and question the pharaoh's religious authority. Now we turn our attention east. This region of the world, what is now modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkmenistan, has a much more mysterious ancient history. Let's start simple. To the immediate east of the Sumerians was the kingdom of Elam, centered on the city of Susa. It was almost as old as Sumer itself, and like the Syrians, it was very influenced by Mesopotamia, even being part of Sargon's empire. It was, however, culturally distinct, speaking and writing in a language that we still haven't deciphered. This will be a common theme for the Eastern Trade Network. Our next stop depends on whether you travel by sea or by land. Let's travel by sea, down the Persian Gulf. Sumerian sources describe a land that they traded with by the sea called Magan, as a source of copper and diorite. We may have located this civilization thanks to archaeology as being in the modern-day United Arab Emirates and Oman. If we sail further east, we stumble upon a large port city in modern-day Pakistan. We don't know the original name of it, but archaeologists call this site Lothal. It was part of a much larger civilization stretching across the entire Indus River Valley. So we call it the Indus Valley Civilization, or IVC. I want to focus on the IVC because of how incredibly unique it is in its mystery, and I believe it's a good example of the picture that I want to paint later on. The IVC, as the name suggests, was centered on the Indus River. Today the region is arid, but back then this wasn't the case. It was much wetter and humid, being seasonally flooded by winds carrying storm clouds from the ocean. These were the monsoons, and they gave the region life from about 3300 BC to 1900 BC. Local peoples moved in from the mountains, and they tamed the river and its various tributaries by building complicated drainage systems to divert water, and they farmed the area as well. In many ways, the beginning of civilization here sounds similar to Mesopotamia, but once again, there are differences. After 3300 BC, towns slowly became cities, like the site of Kot Dishi. By 2600 BC, the region was thoroughly urbanized. The IVC consisted of many cities, as large or maybe even larger than the Sumerian ones. Sites include the massive Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, unique because of their incredible city planning and almost perfect grid-like structure, even having sanitation and plumbing systems. Yet they had no central palace structure or temple complex to speak of. Even weirder, some cities like Mohenjo-daro, despite their massive size, had almost no fortifications or remnants of any weapons. Even more frustratingly, despite having a written language, it has not been deciphered. This left many archaeologists guessing at how these cities could have been so deliberately planned, yet seemingly lacked a central authority, and was also somehow devoid of military conflict. Yet, as stated before, it was greatly tied to Mesopotamia for much of its existence. The IVC was surrounded by much material wealth, such as precious lapis lazuli, and even a source of tin in Afghanistan. We found both IVC and Mesopotamian artifacts in both civilizations, and the Mesopotamians did write about them as trading partners. They were a major player in the ancient world. The social structure of the IVC, however, remains a mystery. As mentioned before, in many ways their cities were astonishingly unique for the ancient world, and we simply don't know why. We do, however, have hints. All the cities seem to have the same standardized weights, seals, and even brick ratios. Maybe they had a single unified state, like Egypt had. Egypt managed to unite this early after all, and that would explain why Mohenjo-daro didn't have fortifications, or if the whole civilization was the same country, it couldn't invade itself, obviously. We do have this statue that archaeologists have dubiously named Priest King, only because the figure vaguely looks important, but we have no idea who he actually is. The IVC also could have been egalitarian, spreading its political functions and decision-making across all of its citizens, almost like ancient Athens, which was ruled by a direct democracy and had no kings. But then, why the lack of warfare? Athens still managed to be pretty expansionist at times. Maybe, being a center of trade, the cities were more like oligarchies of artisans and merchants like Carthage. The same problems arise for the single-state hypothesis, like why did they seemingly not face the threat of barbarian invasion despite the region being so exposed to it, particularly from its west? In future millennia, Pakistan would be a hotbed of invasion and violence. It just doesn't add up. We may never know for sure, certainly not if we don't decipher their written language. By 1900 BC, possibly due to the 4.2 kiloyear event, the monsoons stopped coming and the region became drier. The cities were abandoned forever, yet in some ways their legacy lives on in more subtle ways. That's a story for another time. The 4.2 kiloyear event had drastic consequences for much of civilization. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, it reshaped those societies, sometimes in major ways. As Babylon was redefining the meaning of empire and expanding central authority and adherence to the cult of Marduk, Egypt was losing a centralization it once had. In other places like the Indus Valley, civilization suffered immensely, eventually being lost. Yet, in the face of changing circumstances, the civilized world adopted and expanded, not through conquest, but trade. We saw the birth of international trade on a new level never before seen, and the immediate economic effects of it. Next time we'll discuss another effect of the 4.2 kiloyear event, far away from the civilizations of our focus. New peoples will spill into the lands, reshaping the cultural context of them forever. This will be the age of the chariot. But for now, I'll leave you with this. The prophecy of Nefret was one of the few literary texts we have from ancient Egypt, telling a story of how chaos would collapse Egypt and how a king would restore Maat. The Egyptians would spend the second millennium BC chasing a return to order like they once enjoyed in the Old Kingdom. They and the Babylonian monarchs would fiercely resist change. To an extent, this change was driven by nature herself, throwing the whole world into flux. But as the winds blow in new directions, it's this very resistance to change that leaves empires to the sands of time. Think about this, and think about our culture. Today we like to imagine our relationship with culture in a narrow way. On the individual level, we think a lot about how culture influences us. But do we ever think about how we influence culture? Today, as nature blows in new directions, we must consider how we wish to participate. Are we just observers, or are we doers?